Gwe, Upsalada Gwe. Hello, welcome. My name is Neil Silcox. I am the Faculty Excellence Developer here at the Maple League of Universities. I'm really excited to welcome you to this terrific session. I am joining you from Kutupuk, which is colonially called Halifax. It's in unceded Mi'kmaq territory here in what is called Nova Scotia, Canada. I'm really excited to welcome two folks for this beautiful dialogue we're about to have. Dr. Ashwani Kumar is an award-winning professor of education at Saint Vincent University in Halifax, Canada. His teaching and research focuses on meditative inquiry, which is a self-reflective and aesthetic approach to teaching, learning, researching, creating, and living. His academic books include Curriculum as Meditative Inquiry, which won the Outstanding Academic Title Award by Choice Reviews, Curriculum in International Context, Understanding Colonial Ideological and Neoliberal Influences, and Engaging with Meditative Inquiry in Teaching and Learning and Research, Researching Transformative Potentials in Diverse Contexts, which we'll be talking about today. Also joining us is Dr. Manasi Thapliyal, an assistant professor with the School of Education Studies in Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University in Delhi, India. Her doctoral work is in the domain of sociology of higher education, engaged with academic reforms and the dynamics of change in universities through a case study of the University of Delhi. Her research interests include higher education reforms, policy and practice, educational organization and leadership, dynamics of institutional change, academic cultures, the people science movement in India, and education for social transformation. I'm also just going to take a moment to share my screen. There we go. I just wanted to show you the beautiful cover of this book, which is going to be the center of our conversation design, the terrific book, Education in Meditative Inquiry in Teaching and Learning and Research, Realizing Transformative Potentials in Diverse Contexts. If you haven't read this book, that's just fine, but I will really encourage you to do so if you get the chance. And if you are unfamiliar with meditative inquiry, don't worry, we're going to clarify that as part of this conversation as well. But let me do my best to let you know what I have gleaned from meditative inquiry from reading Dr. Kumar's articles in this book. And I would say that it is the goal of bringing a deliberate, compassionate, and empathetic mindfulness to our work. It's a holistic framework for thinking about teaching and research and service and all other parts of our lives, recognizing that they are all really inextricably linked with one another. In a response to this book, Ardra Cole called it a gathering of scholars from diverse contexts in communion around the concept of meditative inquiry. And I think that's a beautiful sentence. It really feels like a community coming together for a conversation. There really is a diverse set of perspectives as well, exploring this concept of meditative inquiry in education at all levels, from elementary school to university to law school, doing it in dialogue with fine arts practice and poetry and Buddhism and martial arts, and addressing social justice in many forms, from self-love to trauma-informed practice to queerness and Indigenous ways of knowing. And I'll say personally that since engaging with this book and this work, I've noticed a shift in my own life and in my own teaching. Firstly, there's a terrific image that comes from Dr. Kumar of, that students can sometimes feel like they've been thrown in the river when you address this work and that they don't know how to swim, but that they are comforted by ourselves getting in and getting in the soup with them. And it's a thing that I have really been trying to do more and more as I teach. And one thing that I really carry in all aspects of my life is this invitation to listen to silence. I'm in theater, and so I love to fill the silence. I love to talk, and I was always a little uncomfortable with it. And for a while, I started to try and let silences be there for the sake of teaching. And the thing that I have come to now is really listening to that silence and listening to myself, listening to my students, listening to the universe while we're in those moments of silence. And I'm really grateful for this book, for opening this up to me. And I really hope that you will be intrigued by this conversation and read it or reread it after this. The conversation will go on for a little while between our guests, and we will have a Q&A section at the end. If you'd like to post questions along the way, please put them in the chat box, and I will try and pull them out for that Q&A session, but we are going to let the chat flow naturally. And with that being said, I will throw it to you. Thank you so much. Please take it away, Manasi.
Thank you, Neil. Um, I'll begin with a little bit of autobiographical reflection on my engagement with Ashwani over the years. I met him as a teacher trainee or pre-service teacher educator in the year 2004. So it's almost nearly 20 years of knowing him in different ways. I met him at a time where I had just done 5 years of physics and was training to be a physics teacher. And he came with his pre-doctoral degree in geography. And I met him closely, I interacted closely with him for an assignment we had to do on Paulo Freire. I remember it so vividly that, we were given a list of 6 or 5 thinkers, and only a few of us chose Paulo Freire. We had Rabindranath Tagore, we had Gandhi, we had some others, John Dewey, and my entry into, or impulse to take up Paulo Freire was very, very distinctly. I had no idea who this fellow was. I was listening. He was not part of our direct, course list, but his name was popped up in the philosophy class, and I'm really grateful for having chosen Paulo Freire that day, because I got to engage with and interact with Ashwani and a bunch of other friends, very few of them. And we started on a very long drawn conversation, which is still ongoing. My engagement with this whole idea of education for social transformation, which is where Ashwani's work also comes in terms of placing self with respect to the social, placing self with respect to the idea of change and institutions, kind of builds up from there. We had conversations over the years on my quest with understanding nature of science, my quest with understanding the disciplinary knowledge in physics, and Ashwani introducing me to David Bohm through his dialogues with Krishnamurti. Over the years, I have personally kind of stepped away, stepped close, responded to uncertainties with respect to where is this kind of inquiry leading me up to, personal anxiety with respect to seeing the futility of the idea of change, for instance. I did my pre-doctoral work on social people science movement in India, whose whole project of like 3-4 decades post-Indian independence was on using or taking science to people in a way as a vehicle for social transformation, working around categories of faith versus development, faith versus scientific inquiry. And there, my kind of location of, a difficulty with respect to what Ashwani had to say even then, his engagement with Krishnamurti's work, his engagement with the idea of, awareness or human consciousness as the seat for engaging with social conflicts, psychological conflicts, and my concern with understanding or making sense of how scientific inquiry is the base of modernity, or how scientific inquiry can actually lead you from places where you can struggle with, fight injustice, which is deeply rooted in the social, which is deeply rooted in unjust structures that we have inherited, whether they are part of our colonial legacy or they are part of our ancient legacy, which is marked by deeply casteist Brahminical structures. So for me, the conversation or dialogue with Ashwani kind of began from there. Scientific inquiry vis-a-vis, he didn't have coined the term or didn't use the term meditative inquiry then, but locating the seat for social change in the self, or saying that, as the book says, that human consciousness is in conflict. And it is when you address the conflict at the level of self that you can work towards engaging with structures more meaningfully. So I think beginning with that, the conversation I've had with Ashwani over the years has also kind of hit, and I must confess it to begin with, I have been listening to Ashwani as he worked on his doctoral, chapters, thesis. He would share drafts with me. I would read it, and I would disengage. I felt uncomfortable engaging with what he was proposing. Beginning with Paulo Freire and my engagement with people science movement, and the whole idea of science for social transformation, I kind of felt uncomfortable with this idea of thinking that, just the self or engaging with the mind could do something which the other two traditions would not enable you to do. There was also a discomfort with the whole Krishnamurti's perspective on, the idea of who is the one who's making sense. Can there be observation without observer? For me, those were very strong stumbling blocks in engaging with, the theoretical frame around which Ashwani's work kind of, builds on, or which is rooted. I felt a personal existential difficulty in connecting with these ideas. I was struggling. I was also a student who was kind of first generation academic. I had battled poverty. I had seen, I belonged to a privileged upper caste family, but had engaged with, or had gone through various levels of, socioeconomic deprivations. So to say, to struggle to make feet, to find my feet in academia, and therefore, success in career or success in academia unfolded for me in a very different way. It meant those markers of, leaving people behind, of reaching an end point of excellence, assessing myself in terms of my productivity in certain ways. I had constructed that self for myself, which what Ashwani proposed in terms of, what is success? What is academic success? What is failure? It kind of unsettled my way of being for the longest time. And yet I had this idea constantly churning within me, which kind of asked me to reflect on that when I read, for instance, John Holt's work, How Children Fail, right? I vividly remember an excerpt from the text, I don't know, one of the books, where he talks about how when he entered a teacher education classroom, he tried to make eye contact with the people present in the room. These are young people who are preparing to be teachers. And none of them would make an eye contact with him. And he reflects on this whole experience that these are students whom he asked that, have you stepped out into the world? Have you seen the world? Have you seen your fears? I'm kind of extending that argument, but he reflects on that moment where people feel scared to make that eye contact for the fear that something may be asked of them, for the fear they may be asked to voice what they think, for the fear that they may have to voice themselves out. And fear of owning up to that voice kind of ringed in my own head as an educator or as a student. So there, engaging with what Ashwani had to say also meant engaging with what I had to say. It also meant engaging with who I was as a person. And I don't think I was ready for that for the longest time, because I had so many things to achieve. I had to take care of that constructed identity of what it would mean to have done justice to my parents, what it would mean to do justice to the years of investment they did on my education. How I had to first take care of X number of goals before I could stop and face my fears. Or I stop and face or respond to what Ashwani is saying. So I engaged in these conversations with him. He would tell me about his encounters with Gurdjieff, with Krishnamurti, with Osho, with Ashutosh Kalsi, and I would just celebrate them in my head as feeling happy for my friend that he is able to engage in these conversations. But over the years, going through personal experiences in a way which kind of force you to take things head on, to address and face up to questions which I had pushed quite far behind, allowed me also to engage with Ashwani's voice more clearly. It asked me or allowed me to think in terms of what does myself stand for? What is the self that I'm working towards? Is myself the identity of the assistant professor? Is myself the identity of an assistant professor who would not get due promotions for the next 5 years? Is myself that of a parent who constantly thinks and frets over not being a good parent, or struggles with the idea of what would good parenting mean. Did I do an intellectual suicide by marrying too young? Did I force myself, cut my life short in a particular way by choosing to be a parent too young? Did I do injustice by bringing a new life into this world? Was I ready for it? I have not seen myself, and I have brought another life into this world. And as I read this volume, I think a lot of these questions, I was happy to say that, I was happy to see that the journey of last 4 or 5 years in particular had prepared me to face up or to engage with these dialogues in my own heart. And therefore, I agreed to Ashwani's invitation to reflect on his journey on meditative inquiry with all of you today. So I think taking it up from there, I think maybe a brief introduction to what Ashwani refers to by the whole idea of meditative inquiry, and then we can take this conversation forward with Ashwani and invite him to share more and reflect more on the key concepts, as well as his personal journey into engaging with these concepts and giving them life. As Neil also mentioned, in his work, Ashwani emphasizes meditative inquiry as an art of understanding oneself and one's relationship to people and world, responding to our existential quest as human beings, to ask fundamental questions about the meaning, origin, and purpose of life. And when I shared my discomfort earlier, it was more in the sense of being ready for recognizing that existential quest as part of my life, as life itself. He says that meditative inquiry is about perceiving, or the core principle of meditative inquiry approach is to see that life is whole, it is undivided. To appreciate it, to recognize it in its entirety, it's important to be awakened to it, to pay attention to it, an undivided, pure attention, or what he refers to in Krishnamurti's drawing on Krishnamurti's insights as pure observation. He says that meditative inquiry is an emergent process of learning and discovery that unfolds organically when one lives attentively. As one reads this volume, which is an invitation of a dialogue to his fellow travelers who have had conversations with him, who have spoken to this idea of this idea of engagement within the classroom space as an extension of engagement within the self, one finds a constant reiteration and validation of this idea of how life unfolds at each moment, and how that unfolding of life can be manifested or can be nurtured within the space of a classroom. His work highlights significance of contemplative and meditative awareness for educational thinking and practice. He emphasizes it to be part of an existential movement, therefore. Life as an unfoldment, to live is to keep on unfolding, living fully, living meditatively, living creatively, and living with your whole being. He asked me specifically to not begin the questions by asking him, what is meditative inquiry? So I took the liberty of describing it in his words. He says something which for the longest time I have personally struggled with. He says that it's not a strategy. It's not equivalent, it meaning meditative inquiry, is not equivalent to a method. It may entail meditation, it entails meditation as a process, but it goes beyond meditation and mindfulness-based activities. For me, coming from where I was, I struggled with the instrumentality of this idea of being wholly there. What does it mean to be a whole person? What does it mean to be fully attentive at any given moment in time? Scientific inquiry is marked by, at least in the textbook definition of it, by a strategy, by a process. you may debate the process, but would they be the same way in which could you be this meditative whole? Could you be this whole person if you followed a strategy of meditation? His work says or attests to the fact that it cannot be reduced to the strategies. It entails dialogue. It entails what he is now building up on as dialogic meditative inquiry. Its precepts or its founding pillars are deep non-judgmental listening, creating a personhood which can be this whole, which can listen without fragmenting, can listen with the whole attentive being. An inquiry which is marked by playfulness, by authentic curiosity, by a commitment to exploration and introspection. I think, Ashwani, you can respond to or enter the conversation at this point by maybe reflecting and building upon this idea of how do you see this when you say that meditative inquiry is more than just the strategies of meditation or attention or some activities of mindfulness. It is that, of course, but it is more than that. Could you help us move in that direction?
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Manasi. Let me begin by thanking Neil for having me, for having you, for having us here and giving us this platform to explore meditative inquiry a bit further. So thank you, Neil. And as Manasi mentioned in her autobiographical reflections, we have known each other for about 20 years. And I would say in my own experience, actually, Manasi and I used to come from the same locality, like similar locality, not the same locality. And we have done a lot of bus rides together. And we have spoken a lot in the teacher education faculty and in the buses and all that. And I would say that Manasi is one of the best minds I have ever interacted with. So it has been a privilege that Manasi is here and having this discussion with me. We also connected because of the similar socio-economic background, because I also faced difficulties in my life growing up. And for some reason or the other, we were always drawn to similar teachers. We were always impressed by kind of similar, like both of us were thought very highly of certain teachers, and that also kind of connected us. As Manasi mentioned that early on in our conversation, I didn't have a conscious understanding of that though, that Manasi had a resistance to what I was saying. So Manasi, a confession from my part too. But I do know that a lot of folks have resistance because whatever challenges their inner psychological structures that they have put together, which we call self, and the meanings that they have put together, the assumptions they have put together, the paths they have put together for themselves, when they are challenged, it creates a disturbance within ourselves. And nobody likes to be disturbed. Psychologically, we never like to be disturbed, right? So I totally understand where you are coming from, because I have had the same experience within me. When I came across the ideas that were disturbing, that were challenging, it creates a kind of an existential crisis in you, right? But for some reason, I was always drawn to that kind of an experience. And I feel that the people who I have interacted with personally, academically, in my friend circles, uh, have experienced that challenge. Because if you are challenging yourself, the people who are around you are going to be challenged as well. So thank you, Manasi, for sharing that autobiographical reflection. I think it was very, very helpful. And over the years, Manasi has invited me to her teacher education classes and the graduate education classes at Ambedkar University, and I've thoroughly enjoyed interacting with Manasi and her students. And it was so wonderful that Manasi accepted this invitation. to have a conversation with me, because I have written quite a bit on what I think meditative inquiry is, what I think its place in life is, what its place in education is. And I really enjoy this process of dialogical exploration and discovery. And when I met Mansi this winter in New Delhi, when I visited her class, that's when it occurred to me it would be wonderful if Mansi is interested that we explore this volume on meditative inquiry together. So before I answer your question, Mansi, just one more thing. This volume that Neil gave you a very good introduction of, has kind of emerged uh, after due to a lot of engagement with my students and colleagues and friends on the work that I have been doing on this notion of meditative inquiry. And at one point, it occurred to me that a number of folks have interest in exploring this idea further, not only independently, but also in relation to their own work, in relation to Afrocentricity, in relation to indigenous thinking, in relation to positive psychology. So I thought of creating a space of invitation, a dialogical space where I can engage with these folks. And that's how this book came into existence. We also, last August, we had a conference on this book, which is available freely online. So we can send the links through Neil if anybody is interested. All right, Mansi. So let me know if I understand your question correctly. You are saying how meditative inquiry is different from mindfulness and meditation activities, right?
Yes. And then you are saying that uh, it's more than just the strategies. It's more than the method. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there are so many things that I can explore in that context, but let's begin by understanding why is somebody interested in meditation strategy or mindfulness method. I think that interest comes when one sees that there is a problem within oneself. Either there is disturbance, either there is a conflict, or there is a stress, or there is anxiety. And because of that, one is looking to ways which can ease that conflict, ease that anxiety, ease that stress, right? Something that can take away that. So that state of mind from which the desire to find something, a strategy, a technique, a method, a path, that it emerges from a space which is in conflict, which is experiencing difficulty and doesn't know what to do with it. And our society functions on the capitalistic model. If there is a need, there will be a supply. And what has happened with mindfulness and meditation activities is they have isolated the problems of life, the conflict of consciousness, as Krishnamurti calls it, or the deeper sources of difficulties and problems within oneself. It has replaced them with isolated problems that can be solved by specific methods and techniques, right? Whole of the Western psychology kind of functions on that. Isolate the problem and find a step-by-step structured solution to it, rather than understanding the whole nature and structure of the problem, rather than understanding that the self is situated in the social and the economic context in which it lives, right? That the self, the very notion of self has inbuilt problems of comparison, problems of uh, isolation, because the very notion of self, especially the way it has emerged in the West, it is an isolated entity, myself, as opposed to other people's selves, right? So the way I think is that this whole notion of mindfulness and meditation activities kind of has become disconnected from its very roots. So the whole notion of mindfulness, we all know, comes from Eastern wisdom, especially the insights of Buddha. But the whole focus of Buddha was not to ease your stress and tension. It was to find truth. It was to find peace in life, a true peace, not a peace so that you are peaceful and you can produce more, so that you are peaceful and you can perform better on standardized tests, not that so that you're peaceful and you can really give an excellent talk or something. The whole notion of the peaceful was to have a peaceful self, or a peaceful being, and from that whatever will emerge will be peaceful and create peacefulness around. If you are rooted and situated in truth, you will spread truth, you will live with truth, you will invite people towards that truth, right? So what has happened with the mindfulness and the meditation movement, because of its obsession with scientific measurement, measure, if you breath like this, what happens to your mind, what happens to your heart rate? It's all good, but see the mentality from where it is coming from. Finally, we have another way of taking care of anxieties and stresses, rather than understanding why do we live a life which creates anxiety. Why have we created social, political, economic structures which are anxiety provoking, which create conflict on you, which makes your life better, right? So meditative inquiry is an holistic engagement with life. It's not finding one isolated technique and try to fix a particular problem you are having. On the other hand, the problems, when we feel anxiety, when we feel stress, when we feel jealousy, when we feel a conflict due to comparison, those to me are invitations to go deeper within yourself, because they have caused disturbance. Somebody had something, because of that I'm feeling jealous and I'm going through a disturbance, right? So there are two movements that can emerge from that. One is, okay, I'm going to find a technique that can ease that. Or I can say, oh, this is a great doorway. This is showing me that something externally can cause a disturbance and chaos internally. So let me dive into it. Let me understand why an external circumstance created a disturbance within myself. Let me go deeper into it. And when one goes deeper into it, one sees how one is conditioned, how one is conditioned by the society, how one is been conditioned by the media and the market, how has one been conditioned by one's parents, right? So one disturbance opens up a whole door of inquiry to understanding not only yourself, but yourself in relation to the whole of life, which the isolated meditation techniques and strategies don't focus on, because that's too much of an exploration. Why go into too much of an exploration when you can isolate a technique and strategy and sell it as a remedy? So selling, I would like to underline that word. Due to capitalism, everything is a matter of sale and purchase. So are meditation techniques and strategies. And that's what my problem with them, because they don't give you a holistic existential way of exploring yourself and the world around you, within you, but isolate the problems, fragment the problems as if life is fragmented, as if your jealousy and stress and conflict are independent of how you have been conditioned, how you have been living, where you have been living, in what system have you been living, right? So that's why I would say meditative inquiry is a holistic engagement, rather than it's a systematic step-by-step process of ending, or how would I say, suppressing particular problems that you may have. Have I responded, Mansi?
Yes, you have responded, Ashwini. Since you brought Buddha in, so maybe I was just wondering that throughout Buddha's years, the human Buddha, he propounded different sutras or wisdom, different preachings, and towards the end of his life, it is said that the last set of sutra to be preached is the Lotus Sutra, which was codified several years after his passing. And that's the kind of wisdom for the latter day of the law, as they say, which emphasizes this fact that human suffering is real, and it doesn't have to be that way. that humans have the potential of making sense of that suffering and transforming it, right? So it's not simply a singular, as you mentioned very rightly. It's not an individual endeavor of creating stability for oneself. Stability for oneself means nothing in absence of stability of the larger environment. Or stability of what? I don't know if I'm making sense on that, but my concern has been that, for different people who have experienced life in various forms, not everybody reaches academia, not everybody gets a chance to mull over the spiritual quest or questions which are more existential in nature. The material conditions prevent you from, having the space of privilege to engage with these questions. And then there are, these strategies are also seen in a way to, or, you preach to people, or you look up to these, when you said, selling spirituality, you sell them in the form of self-help culture, where you say that, okay, if you can live through this phase, perhaps there will be light at the end of the tunnel. We're looking again for something very, very external, and we're still confined in the paradigm of the individual. So the self-help industry focuses on the individual and keeps you there. And what I seem to be understanding from what you're saying and what is being written in the reflections from different contributors is that this process is a process of coming to appreciate the interconnectedness of the whole environment, the interconnectedness of self with the other, with the living, the non-living, with our environment, with our culture, with our politics. And unless you undertake that radical inquiry, or you prepare yourself to undergo that journey of finding that interconnectedness, of finding meaning or worth of yourself in that interconnected way of being, it's very difficult to truly undertake it as a transformative exercise. Am I correct?
So the last part I wasn't clear, Manasi. How are you connecting it to as a transformative exercise? Are you saying that because it becomes like too big a project? Is that what you're saying?
To some extent, it becomes too big a project where you cannot envision the limits of it or your contribution to it. You live with a kind of recognition of, for instance, when we say mindfulness, being mindful is also being able to recognize anger in yourself for what it is. Is it self-obsessed emotive anger, which is about your desires not being fulfilled, or your fears realizing themselves true? Or is it about, you being emotionally disturbed from your sense of equilibrium? Or that anger could be emanating from a very deep, seated desire for justice, recognizing the play of forces which are, creating injustice in the first place. And that motivates you to not think of yourself as a victim, but as somebody who plays, creates a narrative of fighting against injustice. In that, what role social movements or political movements play, for instance, they provide you this anchor or a scaffold within which you can locate your anger, you can locate your sense of justice, injustice. You can locate this, this project of what will you work towards step by step. And I would think, like many spiritual orders, I know your position vis-a-vis organized religion, as a space where, again, very, very deep conditioning happens. But religiosity or spirituality as projects which allow you to transcend the egocentric self, can it happen alone? Perhaps that is where I'm trying to get you to reflect on. Can this exercise happen by itself? Can it be a project between like a teacher and your students? Can it be just between two people? Or will it require more organized scaffolding? Perhaps that is where I was trying to go.
I can try to respond to that question, Manasi. I think one thing that is important that I want to emphasize, that I didn't grow up in materially wealthy family, but I still was interested in inquiry, in understanding. I don't know how, and I don't know why. I think I met some people on the way that fueled it, that made me realize the significance of it. But the way it happened was that I was ready to engage with them. So it was mutual. The invitation that came from outside, but there was a lot of willingness within me to accept that invitation, right? So this idea that because I understand where it is coming from, though, that there is poverty, people don't have the time for engagement. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that as a society, we haven't created the conditions in which people can learn about themselves. We haven't created the conditions. See, in India, if you go, I don't know how far this example will go, but let's see, in India, you go everywhere, you hear music, right? You go for your to get your hair done, you hear music. No matter where you are, in the buses, you are hearing music. So music is part of the culture, right? It has pervaded the culture. So the rhythm and the melody, Indian rhythm and melody, becomes part of your mindset without realizing it. Similarly, uh, no, not similarly, on the contrary, this idea that we need to understand ourselves, that there is a need to explore ourselves, that there is a need to understand what is it that we call self. How has that self come into existence? How have I labeled myself? Who has labeled me? Who has created attributes of me? This is, I think, so significant, but we don't consider it significant. In schools, in colleges, that's not part of our curriculum, in families. So part of it is, sure, people don't have the time where they can actually deeply engage within themselves. They can take the time. That's one thing. But on the other hand, we haven't created the atmosphere, the cultural context in which this is a priority, right? So how will it become a priority? So I think it's like similarly about education. We have reduced education to an instrumental activity. That's a cultural phenomena. We see education as a way to get a job. If we had seen education as a way for our holistic development, I don't think money necessarily is the barrier. I don't think we have the perception or the vision. If there is a perception or vision, I think the money will come in, or the necessary resources will come in. Like how much money India and Pakistan invest in building armaments? We are poor countries. Where is that money coming from? There is a willingness there, right? There is a desire. Now Canada is becoming obsessed after the Ukraine-Russia war, right? Now it has to build its armament. It has to become militarily stronger as well. Where is that money coming from? If you see the public education system in India, much better, sorry, in Canada, much better funded than some of the developing countries. But if you ask teachers here, it's an underfunded system too. So where there is a will, when we have a willingness, when the whole culture thinks in that direction, the money begins to go in that direction, right? Or the resources or the intentions begin to go into that direction. So I do realize that when you have material stability, when you have financial, physical security, it gives you more time and space. But as a culture, I don't think we prioritize this for people to have. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think, political and social movements have been important. The movement of decolonization that happened around the world, at least politically, psychologically, it is going on, and I think it will continue to go on, because psychological colonization is much deeper. um, so we when we see the problems in society, the disparities in societies, the ills in society, naturally there is a force that collects together, builds up in the form of a social and political movement to fight that ill, or that evil, or that discrimination. My only thinking is, and I have tried to describe that in curriculum as Meditative Inquiry, my first book, that and Krishnamurti has talked so much about it, that we always tend to locate the crisis outside, thinking that the crisis is outside. But if you go a little deeper, you will see all the crises are connected to how we think, who we are. For example, racism is not an externally existing problem. Like there is a weed, you take it out. It's not that kind of a problem. It is sustained through our intentions, conscious and unconscious, our tendencies to discriminate. So unless there is an ending of that tendency within, you cannot end racism outside. It's impossible, right? So these social and political movements are very helpful, no doubt about that, because the discrimination has reduced, the decolonization has happened. But what people like Krishnamurti are saying, that there is another radical way of changing it, when it has actually transformed yourself, not just intellectually, because intellectually I can understand that discrimination is a problem, but discrimination doesn't operate only intellectually. It has colored our whole being, our whole unconscious. We don't even know that the discrimination is operating, right? We don't even know that the racism is operating. I told you the other day, we were having conversation, right? No matter where we go in Canada, the people, those who are above 50 or 60, Indian people in Canada, they are always interested in learning about what my caste is. Because as I mentioned to you, Kumar is not a caste. It's just a name for anybody can have that surname, right? But they really want to know what is the surname that comes after that. They don't even know that that's a discriminatory way of behaving, right? But that has been their conditioning. Now there is a new conditioning going on that you shouldn't ask the caste. That's also a conditioning. So you may have a desire to know, but you don't know how to ask because it is rude or it is discriminatory. So social and political movement, which means our desire to bring about changes externally in the external structures, is very valid and important. The missing link is, we think by changing the structure you can change the human being. Otherwise, why there is so much perversion? You can't be racist outside, but deep down you are burning with that feeling. You can't be misogynistic outside, but you're burning within. So this burning within is the issue. When there is a transformation of this burning within, the external transformation has a very different dynamic. It is not violent, it is not obsessive, it is not compulsive, because your being is changing. Everything that comes in touch with you begins to change because of that, right? The other thing that you said was, can it be done alone? I'm treating it as a separate thing. The very notion of alone doesn't exist, right? Because we don't exist in isolation. However much we want to believe, we just don't exist in isolation. Our consciousness is connected. Human consciousness is very deep down connected. We are complete, like, there is an African proverb, I am because you are. I hope I'm not saying it incorrectly, but that's it. And that is not only about human beings. I am because the trees are. I am because the sun is. I am because the moon is. I am because the whole life exists, right? So this very idea that I exist as an independent entity, I don't think it is true. It doesn't exist. So even when I think that I am inquiring individually within myself, I think it's a collective and a holistic inquiry. Because when this being exists in any context, with my student, with my friends, anybody, see, even with my friends, it is again a fragmentation and an isolation. In actuality, it doesn't exist like that, right? So I think it's basically holistic and collective. There are so many other things in it, though, Mansi, I don't know whether we want to go into that. So maybe I will say like a few more things in relation to this if needed, because at the same time, just one thing, I'm not saying that there is no individuality. I'm not saying that the two people can't have individuality, but that individuality is not a isolated, self-contained entity that is living for its own fulfillment and pleasure. That's where the mistake is coming in. Like we say, right? Each particle in the universe is different. Nothing is like anything else, but still the whole thing exists together. So I think that's where I would say that the individual, it does exist, but it is not I am as an individual against you.
Right.
So individuality and collective existence, this paradox, I think, is the part of the existence. But shall
In a
we
way,
move on? Yeah.
yeah. In a way, many of the contributions, in fact, most contributions to the volume also kind of reiterate this fact, whether it's Brigham talking about how she sees the connectivity between Afrocentricity, or that spirituality and what connects meditative inquiry, allows you to, as you said, override this binary between self and the world, or individual and the collective. Very close to this, Ashwani, was this concern about, or question around, when we say that it's an approach that allows us to transform the core of our being, right? When we are being mindful, or when we work towards engendering this awareness of non-duality between the self and the world, if I can say that, what's happening is a fundamental transformation of the core of a being. The way you construct yourself, or the way you have fashioned your existence. And you say that it's a very subtle and yet a very, very powerful experience. And I don't know if there is language to talk around this transformation of what transforms. When you said just now that when your being changes, it's not just you who change, it's your environment reflects that change. Experientially, existentially, the nature of relationships you share with living, non-living, with people around you, your environment undergoes the transformation. And for those of us who have not come close to experiencing that subtle but powerful experience, it can be a very difficult concept. And I was reading Powers and Cosgrove's, if I'm pronouncing their names right, their reflections of trying it out in their classrooms, and it seems like you can have the courage to take those baby steps. So that's the second key term I was wanting to come towards, that this work requires tremendous amount of courage. When we say that kindness to oneself, when you say we live through others, right, or we are how others are, it requires enormous amount of kindness to whatever self it is that you are first observing. Unless you have that lens of kindness or deep compassion, that observation itself is very, very difficult. And that is, I think, I'm emphasizing it more because that was my personal struggle, to gather the courage to be kind to what I had constructed as, to see what was going on in my own life. And getting that courage kind of also allows you to overcome that fragility which you carry with you moment to moment. Fragility of, feeling vulnerable, that things will not turn out. So my present I is looking at the future I that I want to manifest. And that constantly plays and interferes in the way I experience every moment. So that courage also requires to let go of that, the future I, and to face or to embrace the past and the present spontaneously with genuine curiosity and compassion. I think that's that experiential or existential aspect of the work that you are proposing for educators and for students. I think that's the heart of that I have understood to be the heart of this practice. And you need fellow travelers. I have struggled with it. So I'm saying it from that perspective, that it doesn't come easy. That courage can be, I could read cognitively. I had processed and churned Krishnamurti individually, but I had engaged with him completely intellectually. And then I rejected to some extent that it's not possible. Unless, what in Eastern traditions, when you talk about consciousness or you talk about reflection, you say that you reflect on an object, right? You reflect on that thing. that you're experiencing in order to create an awareness about what is the object of reflection. But doing something about it or experiencing that in a moment-to-moment basis requires you to move away from the theoretical. That experience cannot be captured in the theoretical terms. It is embedded in the practical, experiential, lived reality, which, like when you do music or when somebody else does dance or otherwise, we emphasize so much about sadhana. This concept of sadhana, that practice and due, in a way, conscious practice and revisiting of certain processes in order to create or bring harmony between the theoretical awareness and the experiential lived reality. So would you care to share some experiences from your own life and lived experiences of how you were able to bring the two together? Or is there a way to bring it? So in a way, it's an instrumentalist question, that how do you do it? So
I think you're asking two things, Manasi. That one is that I think these are two, like it's a tremendous insight. First, I want to recognize that, and then maybe move on to your question. One is that meditative inquiry is not a theoretical construct. In fact, you can get rid of the meditative inquiry completely. You really don't need to focus on these two words as well, because it is the unfolding of the awareness of when you begin to inquire within yourself, you begin to understand life in an organic and spontaneous and existential manner. So it's definitely not a theoretical concept. But in the academic context, I needed to use some terms, so I'm using it. But it's not. Its beauty is it's in its unfoldment and exploration. It's not. It's not a theoretical construct that once you understood and you're done with. It's a constant exploration. Like in Indian music system, we have something called raga, the melodic structures. Raj Chaudhary, one of the previous speakers here, talked about it and in Maple series, and I've been very happy to have been in touch with him. So, but raga, you know a raga, but every time you play it, unless you want to mechanically play it, every time it's a new thing. Each moment in life is new. So meditative inquiry, or it's a process of experiencing life, each moment afresh and new, rather than developing a theoretical construct through which you look at it. If meditative inquiry becomes your lens or a theoretical construct, you miss the whole point. That's the subtle point, right? The subtlety of it. It's not a theoretical concept. The other thing that you said, Mansi, it's very important. It's a tremendous insight. Whenever we see the importance of looking within ourselves, in that instance, it's never going to be easy, because the person, the entity, the individual that is looking within self, what is that self? That self has been taught to be afraid. There is fear inbuilt in that self. That self has been taught to judge oneself and others. That self is conditioned by religion, by politics, by culture, by market. That self has the tendencies to be self-centered, to be jealous. So when you are looking within, you have a fear, right? For example, if I have a fear and I said, okay, I really need to look withinward. When I'm going to take that journey, the first moment, the instances are going to be very difficult, because who is it that is looking at it? This whole structure of the self is looking at itself. And that structure has all the things that I mentioned: the fear, the comparison, the jealousy, the judgmental, the judgmentalness, if I can use that word. Through that, it is looking at a fear. So it tries to suppress it. It tries to control it. You have to be brave. You can't be afraid, or you're just wasting your time looking at it. Go do something in life, or create this or do that, right? So whenever we begin an inward journey, the conflicts begin at that time. So what you're saying, kindness and compassion, you need that. You need to look within yourself. Krishnamurti, you have used to say, you have to be a friend. When you are looking at yourself, you have to look at it yourself like a friend. The time you would say, as if you are looking at a rose, or you are looking at the face of a child. When you are looking within yourself, not looking from the heavy conditioning of judgment and comparison and everything, but can you look, just look for the sake of looking what actually exists. That's a very hard process. It takes a lot of strength, because we have been taught to condemn ourselves, to judge ourselves. We have been conditioned to do that. And we also take, now that's a subtle point, maybe we can go into that later on. We also take pleasure in that, uh, in doing that condemnation and then judgment. But that's something that maybe we'll explore later. So it is very important. It's extremely significant that we have the strength, what you're calling courage, strength to look at within ourselves, not with an intention of, okay, I'm going to end my fear right now, or I'm going to end my jealousy right now, or I'm going to end any conflict I'm having. But can I just be with what I am labeling as fear or jealousy or conflict? Can I just be with it for a little bit and let it be? In that, something else happens. The whole dynamic changes. It's like you are interacting with a child, not forcing the child to do what you want them to do, but just let them be. The whole dynamic, that you're creating a space of freedom, right? Within yourself, saying, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to let it be. And then see what happens. It's a completely different dynamic. The conflict is gone. The sense of freedom is created. So the thing that is bothering you, which is yourself, it has the space to exist. And because it is existing in a space free of conflict, in a space of freedom, in a space of awareness, it shows you what it is, and then it disappears. What was your question other than these two insights that you shared, Mansi, that the need of compassion and kindness, and that it is not a theoretical construct? The question that you were saying, how do I do it?
So I was going there, but since you mentioned, you responded to in this way, I was also thinking that this quest for, it was, I think, Christina Fleming's paper in the volume, where Art and Letters, right? Where she refers to this idea of living from moment to moment, or living through the messy moments of life, right? So life unfolding itself as having the strength to, or the patience to live through the messy moments of life, not wanting resolutions, holding on to these questions, knowing or not caring enough if there would be ready resolutions for that. That kind of quality of existence alters. So I was reading it, and it got answered in many of the chapters. But this whole idea that does this acceptance or owning up to or facing up to what one is, this kind of compassionate, careful attentiveness to who we are, does it create a passive acceptance for how things are? Or can it be a force for transformation, as you've been saying? Because, extending that to the environment, or how would it, how would the project of, for instance, say critical pedagogy manifest through this process?
Yeah, there are so many things in it, Mansi. I think one thing that we need to understand, that we need to be honest with ourselves. What is it that we are looking for? I think that's the most important. Krishnamurti used to ask again and again, what is it that you're seeking? Whatever you are seeking, you are going to get, or you will find ways to get it. So if you are finding a way to soothe your difficulties, you will inevitably find those people who will do it for you. If you are looking ways to suppress, you will get the books and the help self-help and what not, you'll get that. So to me, to reply to your question about how, being brutally honest has been very helpful to me. I've never tried to console myself or soothe myself in any context, and that's not easy. I'm not saying that's not easy from an egocentric perspective, because the whole structure of the brain is to seek security. That's why it allows itself to be conditioned by religion, by this, by that, because it wants security. It wants to feel stable. So, okay, if believing in this going to make me stable, I can be very happy being stable. If believing in this going to make me feel stable, whether it is science or religion or whatnot, the tendency of the brain is to find security and stability. It wants that. It feels certain in that. It feels that it can exist. So that's our deepest hankering in life, is to find security, stability, certainty. For some reason, I've been like very aware of that tendency. Not that that tendency is not within me, but I have not tried to nourish it and sustain it and find it in things. So the impact of that is, it's kind of living with kind of fire. You can never hold on to anything. You can never say, okay, this is it, I got it. This is what it is. That's why I cannot say, okay, meditative inquiry is a structure. You do this and this and this, and finally this is going to happen. It's not like that, because life is not like that. So living with brutal honesty is extremely important, to see what is it that you're looking for, because you're ultimately going to find that, right? People have visions of this deity, this god, this figure. They are sowing the seeds in very deep unconscious. This is what I want to see. And so this is what appears, right? Dreams are a similar phenomena. So what you're looking for, I think, is so important, is so significantly important, that you need to know what is it that you're trying to find. And in this journey, as you said, right, the fellow travelers can help. I definitely had friends like you. I had friends in my neighborhood, and of course through the books, through the teachers who have come across the very radical, and I've always been also interested in very radical teachers, like very radical, who take the carpet from under your feet. I've always find that somehow attractive, that there has to be, this person is not soothing me, this person is not pacifying me, this person is not uh, creating an atmosphere of an ease. This person is actually challenging my whole structure of existence. I'm always drawn towards those. So in a long-winded way, that's how it has helped, because but I can't take the ownership, right? Because it's an emergent process, and that's what I have tried to do, or that's what has happened through me in my classrooms. I haven't created a space where students feel psychological stability and certainty and security. They love the classes. They feel good. They feel centered. They feel they are being heard. They feel connected to each other. But it's not a space where you know a soothing sound is being created for them, so that the actual existential questions and problems go away. They remain very active.
It's heartening, actually, Ashwani, to hear you and listen to the voices that have been captured in the volume, because the kind of transformations higher education systems across the globe are undergoing, and in India right now at a very rapid pace, where the whole instrumentalist neoliberal technical rationality is getting steeped in the very structures in which it will be difficult to be spontaneous. It's going to be increasingly challenging to take authentic self-exploration hand in hand with your students on a day-to-day basis. You'll be watched, you'll be expected to be productive in certain ways. You'll be expected to relate to students in terms of their graduate attributes that you are going to produce in very concrete ways. You are going to be expected to, walk them through the modules in a way that doesn't trigger their sensibilities. So, a classroom which is trigger warning proof, a classroom which is, doesn't disrupt too much, doesn't challenge too much. So in that, to be able to hear the voices and experiences, whether they are from, the spaces of research, how people manifested it in their own inquiry, or your self-reflections or pedagogical reflections. I think it calls for an active process of going into self, into our own selves, undertaking it as educators. This very, very difficult task. But as you mentioned, I think that's the only way I'm going to remember it, being brutally honest. Being brutally honest with yourself in order for us to be able to create that space where we can demonstrate it. I don't know if that makes sense, but unless you see it in the personhood of the person or in the classroom or in the teacher, I think it's not easy. It becomes otherwise mechanical, strategic, rhetoric. So
it is. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's a total organic process, right? It's not a strategy. So you have to engage with it and create your own. I think that's the most important thing. It's a path where your own path emerges, right? And as I said in the very beginning of the book, right, meditative inquiry is not new. It has always existed and it will continue to exist. So it's not me who has created meditative inquiry. It has always existed. The song of creation that I quoted from Rigveda, it's an example of that. It will always exist. See what's happening in India. It's a such a I'm so saddened by what is happening, because when we were studying, the academic space was open. Now what's happening is they're completely following the West in the most perverted way. So the colonization that is happening in India, the academic colonization that is happening in India, is so bad. It's horrible. It's completely falling into the trap of the neoliberal capitalist academy that we have created here in West. It's embracing it. The other day I got an email from Ministry of External Affairs, WebHub, this and that, right? So they are starting some program for, of course, science and engineering professors to visit India, but they have to be from specific universities. It is getting into this ranking measurement. It's really bad. I'm really extremely sorry for India. Not that we are very better off here. We are complete neoliberal capitalist system here too, in the West, in North America. But what's happening in India, it's going to be so bad and perverted. And I don't think a lot of people are seeing it. People like you, Menon sir, Rama ma'am, they're seeing it. But a lot of people have no idea what is happening. The most dangerous thing is happening.
If I can enter here, like briefly, the sad part is like the neoliberal globalization integration of higher education markets is happening simultaneously with this huge, force with which hyper-nationalism, xenophobia of very specific kind, hatred, propaganda against particular religious minorities is on the like crescendo. So you have discourses which are available through social media, which are infiltrating the minds of young people, which are pushing them to align themselves to one identity versus the other, which are creating this false kind of course, a very strong sense of self, which is located in these hyper-national frameworks of particular sensibilities. And there is where, there is so much radical potential in the classrooms, whether it is schools or higher education classrooms, where you could help them see these conditionings for what they are, create a sense of how the whole project of othering is politically, socially motivated, whose purposes are it serving. So how do you, when there is mass scale indoctrination happening outside of educational institutions can actually provide a space of allowing people to, be mindful of what is indoctrinating about them. And that is, I think, such a huge potential for a meditative inquiry as a project, as an existential project, which is the only way you can take indoctrination heads on.
That has been my approach. So rather than focusing my attention on changing the structures and policies, which I did, again, that's not a bad thing. I have put my entire intention and attention and efforts in creating dialogical spaces in my classroom and outside, where we can meet, as you're saying, these devastating tendencies head on.
So Ashwani, I'm mindful of the fact that it's
Yeah.
already, we just
Yeah.
have 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Would
So
you want to address some questions in the chat?
yeah, so we can address, yeah, you can address some, I can address some. So Neil, it's your turn now.
Thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions that have come in from the chat, but if someone would care to flip their camera or microphone on and speak a question out loud, you can please maybe raise your virtual hand and I will try and keep track. Or if you can't do that, just turn your camera on and put your hand up. But I'll start with this, which comes from Paul, and there's a follow-up from Hirshikesh. This is regarding disengaging meditative inquiry from a solo self-interested venture towards something more collective. How do we teach this? How do we create the space in our classroom for this deep and holistic engagement? And Hirshikesh adds, how can we teach about holistic engagement to students coming from different cultural, racial, and socioeconomic backgrounds? Are all parents from all backgrounds willing for this holistic engagement? And how can we deal with conflicts of interest?
Well, I think my response, and Mansi, feel free to jump whenever you feel like it, right? My response has always been that charity begins at home. So I also tell my students who are engaging with me that please don't worry about implementing the ideas that you're learning from here into your classroom. That's too quick. You're turning this into an instrumental approach. How about begin exploring yourself? Begin understanding yourself. Have you taken the time to understand your classroom context? What the classroom context is like? Like I do often do an autobiographical statement in my class, and a bunch of other things I do. I don't think we have the space for that right now, but you can read some of my writings that will give you some ideas. But my focus is not on how we can take it to the classroom right away. I think more important thing is, do I understand it for myself, what it means? Have my own meditative inquiry begun? Independent of what I am saying about meditative inquiry, has my own meditative inquiry begin to emerge within myself? Because it's an organic process, then that will transform any context you are in, whether it is the home context or it is the classroom context. Then the ideas to transform your class naturally will occur to you. How in what way the classroom can become a space of dialogue, in what way class can become a space where we provide students freedom so that their creativity can shine, their true creativity can emerge, right? Mansi, any thoughts you may have?
I think I agree with you. I'm more interested in how you respond to the next question, I think by Daniel Pierce, speaks, kind of gives voice to my questions also. How we reconcile any revelations. Okay, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, how do we reconcile any revelations we may come to through engaging in the process of introspective personal inquiry with systemic barriers, creating the less than optimal conditions we find ourselves constrained by as society? The cognitive dissonance created by way things are contrasted with the way they could seem as impossible hurdle.
If I am understanding the question right, I'm thinking that the questioner is asking that when you go inside, you discover a lot of the external barriers that are imposed on you. Is that what you're saying? And the more you see that, the more you realize that it is impossible to change the system, to change the society, and change oneself. Is that correct? Have I, Daniel, have I interpreted your question correctly?
Danielle says in the chat, yes. How do you not fall to apathy?
To apathy, yes. I think again, like if you remember when Mansi was talking about the compassion and kindness, and my response to that if we create a space where we let the internal struggles, dissonances, conflicts to exist for a moment. I'm just in the process of editing a book of one of my friends. Mansi mentioned his name, Ashutosh Kalsi, And one of the thing that he's saying in that book, which is so important and radical for most of us, is that can you let it be? Can you let those dissonances, those conflicts, those struggles be? Because when you let them be, you will see what they are truly. And then in that space of, when we leave a land empty for a while, it rejuvenates itself. When we stop polluting a river, it will cleanse itself. So the mind has the capacity to cleanse itself, to be free of the destructive and negative patterns. But the art is, and that's why it's an art. There is not a scientific step-by-step process. The art is, can we let the dissonances be and not change them, not do something to them? That's the hardest part for the mind to understand, because the brain, as soon as see, the process is very quick. A disturbance happened, mind already quickly recognize its dissonance. It doesn't like it, it enters the struggle. So when the dissonance or the struggle happen, in that moment, and the more you go deeper, the more your intensity will help you. As soon as the disturbance happen, you feel a flicker of disturbance, and you become, I shouldn't say you become better at it, because it's very self-centered, egocentric kind of a way of saying, but your being, your brain becomes very intelligent. And any flicker of a disturbance, and you know that the disturbance is happening, and if you let it happen, be with it, you will see it will leave you, and it will make the brain more intelligent. It will create a clear space within yourself. But the hard part is learning how to let it be, how to just let the disturbance be.
I don't know if this is Diane Obaid who's written that acceptance is difficult, but it doesn't mean that we agree with the oppression.
Of course.
Yeah. So I think if one looks at history of people who really stood out, like in India, for instance, Dr. Ambedkar's, he belonged to a community who was the most disenfranchised in the country, suffered the worst of marginalization and oppression. And yet his commitment to creating a new world order for India, so to say, even pre-decolonization, to create a new society which is not based on casteism and Brahminical oppression, required, I think, deep amount of commitment to the cause, right? So awareness of oppression, I think, creates a context in which you also find or explore ways of fighting it, of contributing to the struggle against it. That's something which I think the mindfulness or constant engagement requires one to do.
Absolutely. If mindfulness, if being aware of your thoughts and emotions and your place in society, making you insensitive, apathetic, isolated, isolating yourself from the world, I think something wrong has gone. Because the more we become aware of ourselves, the more mind become intelligent and sensitive to the social problems and issues that it comes across. So definitely, I don't think meditative inquiry is a way of apathy. It's a way of great sensitivity.
Well, I think that might be a wonderful place to wrap up. We have one final tradition here at Better Together. If it's your first time with us, hold on, I'm going to turn off the recording. Goodbye, the internet.